Hello to everybody that's attending this webinar. I'm definitely excited to be here to talk about the AWS tools for Windows PowerShell. And we only have 45 minutes and we've got a lot to talk about, so just want to dive straight in and talk about what we're going to cover. So what we'll go through is just give you an idea of how to set up the tools, how to get things installed, which is pretty straightforward, and that'll be quick. And then we want to go into actually doing stuff that's useful that you can walk away with this webinar and use immediately. And there's about almost 1,000 PowerShell commandlets in the AWS tools for Windows PowerShell. So obviously, we can't showcase every single command, but what we're going to do as a starting point is, we'll work with EC2 instances, talk about how to deploy EC2 instances, how to kind of manage them, how to tag them and add storage and things like that, how to bootstrap them with user data. And then at the end, we'll look at a fairly complex script that will do a complete deployment, basically building a private and public subnet in a VPC, putting instances in each subnet, and you'll have all the code that will basically step you through that process of building out all of those resources. So not just building the VPC and the subnets, but also setting up routes, across the subnets and things like that. So a fairly complex script that hopefully you can take and use in more detail for your own scripts. And again, we'll have some other resources that point you to other services, such as S3 and things like that, where you can kind of take what you've learned and apply them to those services. So before we dive in and start looking at a bunch of code, it is going to be useful to have some background with Amazon EC2, the Elastic Compute Cloud. Having gone through and built instances on your own in the past, even if it was just in the EC2 graphical console, will be good because it'll give you some background as to what we're doing in code. Same thing goes with Amazon VPCs. Some exposure to that will be helpful. Of course, Windows Server 2012 is what we'll be deploying for our operating system, actually 2012 R2 more specifically. And then some PowerShell basics. You don't have to be a PowerShell expert to get a lot out of this webinar, but it will be helpful for you to kind of understand the PowerShell architecture, so to speak, the verb-noun or verb-singular noun kind of naming convention that they use for commandlets, and basically the concept of running a commandlet and assigning parameter values to one or more parameters. So having kind of that basic background of all of those things will be helpful. If you're just brand new to AWS, you can check out the documentation, or getting started documentation more specifically, to kind of ramp up on EC2 and VPC. And of course, there's tons of resources out there on the Microsoft websites for introductions to PowerShell basics as well. So with that, let's talk a little bit about getting your tools set up. So like I said, this is fairly straightforward. Obviously, you need to have an AWS account before you get started. You'll need to have PowerShell version 2 or later installed on the machine where you want to use the tools on. Now, you might have noticed there's lots of new PowerShell versions coming out. PowerShell 3 came out, then 4, now 5 is in preview. So you can use versions 2, 3, or 4. Those will all work great with the tools. Version 5, since it's in preview, I haven't really tested that yet. You could try that out. You probably want to wait and get the production full release of 5 before trying to get a fully supported type of configuration with that. So stick to 2, 3, or 4. You can install the Windows Management Framework version 4 on a Windows 7 machine, and that's what I'm using in this environment, and you'll see that on my machine. And then what we do is download and install the tools for PowerShell, the AWS tools for PowerShell. So if you go to that link that's on the slide, aws.amazon.com/PowerShell, that'll take you to a page where you can download the MSI installer, and it's actually going to download the .NET SDK. And let me just switch over to the browser real quick here. You'll see that this is the page, the link that we were just talking about. If you click this button here, AWS Tools for Windows PowerShell, you'll see that the AWS Tools and SDK for .NET is really the MSI package you're pulling down. So you'll see that the PowerShell is a component that you can optionally include, and you can kind of turn off the other stuff that you don't want. But if you're also working in the .NET world, it's nice to install the SDK to have the plugins for Visual Studio as well. So you might want to take all of that for a test drive. I will say that this page is very useful, especially after this webinar and you want to go back and kind of dive deeper into some other things. We're going to cover most of the stuff in the Getting Started section here. That's going to talk about getting your credentials set up and kind of setting up your environment. There's a commandlet reference that'll take you through through all of those 900 plus commandlets, and give you a deep dive on the information there for the commandlets. The community forum will take you into the developer forums. We do have a PowerShell forum in there, and our team members are constantly monitoring that forum. If you post something in there, generally you get a response back really quick. So I would encourage you to use that as you start using the AWS tools for PowerShell. Finally, on this page, another resource that's really useful is the developer blog. Our team members on the .NET SDK tools team regularly post articles, not only for developers, but also for PowerShell type of solutions. So there was a recent blog post out there that showed how to use some of our commandlets to import virtual machine images into EC2 from things like Hyper-V and VMware. So definitely keep an eye on that blog, constantly posting interesting stuff on there in terms of PowerShell. So in terms of switching back over to the slides real quick, that's basically the tool setup, very straightforward. When we get to the end, what I'll do is talk about creating a complete server infrastructure with the tools, with the AWS tools for PowerShell. And that'll be that kind of lengthy script that'll automate some of those complex processes for you. Before we get into that though, let me take you through some demos to give you an idea how all this stuff ties together and how you can get started quickly. So what I'm going to do here is switch over to something called the PowerShell ISE, and the ISE stands for Integrated Scripting Environment. It's basically a developer tool, or essentially for PowerShell scripters. So you can kind of think about it as maybe it's a Visual Studio kind of for PowerShell. You'll get this with the Windows Management Framework when you install it. If you're on Windows 7 or Windows 8, you'll notice that this is already installed on there for you, and you just find it in the Start menu. You can go ahead and launch it here. So you'll want to install the tools before getting started. Then you can launch the ISE. You can also launch a standard PowerShell window like this and do things from here, which is also fine. But I'm going to work primarily here in the ISE. Now, just getting started, I haven't actually done anything to authenticate to AWS or set up any credentials. So if I were to try to run something like get EC2 instance, that wouldn't work because I haven't told the tools what my access key and secret access key need to be. So that's one of the first things we want to do to get started. And what I've done is in my PowerShell profile, I've created an access key variable. I've created a secret access key variable as well. And those store my access keys for my account. And that's an administrator account that I'm using that's an IAM user. So a user I created in identity and access management. I generated the keys out of there, and then I stored them in these variables. So the reason I did that is I want to be able to use them in this presentation without putting them in plain text on the screen. Okay, so let me show you how this kind of works. If you do a get AWS credentials and you do a dash list stored credentials, you'll see that currently you don't have anything stored. And what I want to do is I want to take those access keys, I want to store them in something called the SDK store, which is an encrypted credential store on this machine. That way I don't have to embed credentials in plain text in any of my commands or any of my scripts that I'm going to save later. So what I want to do is, one way I can do this, and there's a couple ways, you'll see it in the documentation, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a set AWS credentials, and I'm going to store them under a profile. I'll just call it AWS PSH, and I'm going to provide the access key and the secret key here. And again, these are in variables. You could actually type this in these values here for access key and secret key. It could just be the plain text representation of your keys. But I just want to get these stored in that SDK store so they're encrypted. And then I can kind of just move on from there. So let me hit enter here. We go ahead and store that. And now what I could do is if I wanted to run get EC2 instance, I could run that with a profile name, which would be the profile I just created, which was AWS PSH. And then, of course, I need to specify the region. And since Oregon is close to where I'm at right now, I'll use US West 2 as a region. So from there, I could run that. The commandlet is going to use the underlying APIs for AWS to basically call out to that service, and it's going to retrieve the instances that I have out there and then send them back to me in a PowerShell type of environment. It's object-based that I'm used to as a Windows guy. So that's nice and everything, but what I want to do is kind of make it a little bit easier. I don't want to have to always type a profile in there, and I don't always want to have to specify the region. So we do have another way that you can do that as well. So let me clear the screen. I'm just going to type CLS to clean up the screen. What I want to do is I'm going to initialize my AWS defaults. So another one of our commandlets here. And then I'm going to specify the profile name. And that was AWS PSH. And then I'm going to specify the region, which is going to be US West 2. And so when I initialize those defaults, that means that every time I start up the ISE or anytime I start up, the independent PowerShell environment from down here, it's going to load up these defaults. It's going to load my credentials from the credential store. It's going to default me into US West 2. And if I clear the screen and just run get EC2 instance, you can see now that I'm targeting Oregon and I'm authenticating with my IAM user, and I don't have to provide all of those extra parameters. So from here, it's very easy for me to go and start working with the commandlets and keep my syntax somewhat concise. I could target a separate region if I wanted to. I could do get EC2 instance and use the region parameter. So if I wanted to switch over to US West 1 for a temporary amount of time and see what was out there, I could do that and then switch back. You could set your AWS default region again. So if you wanted to change the default after you'd already initialized it, you could do that. And you could also clear it by clearing the AWS region or the default region as well and kind of start over. If you look at Get AWS region, that'll show you all of the regions that you have access to. You can see that US West 2 Oregon is my shell default. And it's kind of the high level of getting your credentials set up and figuring out how to work with the regions. It's nice not to have to type the access keys in there and in the profile name or the region and things like that. One thing to mention real quick that I kind of skipped over that might not be so obvious if you're still on PowerShell version 2 is that you probably noticed that I didn't do anything to load the AWS environment, and that's because PowerShell version 3 and higher has a concept known as module autoloading. And it basically says, if I see you run a PowerShell command in that module, I'll go ahead and load the module for you. So I didn't have to do anything special to get the environment loaded into the shell, even though I didn't tell it to do anything. So basically, if you're on version 2, the gist of it is, if you run get module and you list available modules, I'll do a little wildcard here. So I just get back what I'm interested in. You'll see that the module name is AWS PowerShell. And it's important on version 2 that if you're going to use these commandlets, you first do an import module like this. And that will bring in all of the commands. You can kind of see they're truncated here, but here's all of our AWS commands. If you import them there, then you have access to them. If you're on version 3 or higher, you don't even have to worry about this stuff. You can just start typing and it all works. So let's clear the screen here and kind of move on to another topic. We looked at regions, we looked at specifying credentials. Let's talk a little bit about discovery now that we have an idea of how the module works and what the name is. So if you're looking for commands that are in the module, like I said earlier, there's almost 1,000. If you run git command, you specify the module, you can tell PowerShell to just return the commandlets that are in that particular module. So now you know the name of the module. That would give you back a list, if we hit enter, of over 900 commandlets. If I just pipe this to select first 5, just to keep it a little bit cleaner, you can see that it gives me the first 5 that are in that list. If we pipe it to measure object, that'll actually tell us how many are actually in the module. So we've got 936. But the nice thing about git command and specifying the module is you can use that as a way to discover which commandlets are out there, because you might not always know off the top of your head what a commandlet name is. This is one way for you to kind of do some discovery and figure out what the command names are before you start using them. Another example along those lines would be something like git command, and instead of specifying the module, perhaps specify the verb or the noun. So verb as in get or new or something like that, and the noun as that that noun and a prefix, which is usually based on a service. So for example, we've got EC2, right? So I don't really need to tell it the module here because most noun prefixes aren't going to be EC2. That's a service at AWS. So if you run that, that's one way you can do some command discovery for just the EC2 commandlets based on the noun. And notice I used a wildcard there. So EC2 asterisk, and it gave me everything with that, with a matching noun, right? So I could also do it based on verb. So I could say verb, new, and noun, maybe something like that. And there's all of the new EC2 commandlets we have out there. So that's how you do command discovery. Once you figure out what the name of the command is, like new EC2 address or new EC2 instance, for example, then you can run git help. And the git help will give you, an idea of what the parameters are on the commandlet. In a lot of cases, there are commandlets that have help examples. Some of them don't yet because the commandlets are auto-generated based off of the code that's in the .NET SDK. So we're working on filling out additional help examples there. But to give you an idea, what you could do is you could use the help alias, run that against new EC2 instance with -examples, and that actually shows you on this commandlet how do you go ahead and run EC2 instance, what parameters do you need to provide. And in this case, we've got two examples in there for you, one to create an instance and one to add an EBS volume, or actually another disk in a block device mapping to an EC2 instance. So a couple examples in there that you can use to get started. And remember, help, you can use the help alias or you can use get help to do that as well. Now, don't worry if you're seeing a bunch of commands go by. I'm going to, at the end of this presentation, give you a download with a script that'll kind of walk you through all of these examples. So don't worry about trying to record these or anything like that. And those will be there for you later on. So now that we know how to figure out what commands are out there and how to find help, another thing real quick that I just want to touch on is the git history commandlet to show you your previous history. I use this quite a bit to figure out what I ran before, or maybe I don't want to type everything out from scratch. If you just run git history, that'll give you everything that you've run recently. Now, we also have a shell variable that we include called AWS history. So, the git history commandlet is built into PowerShell. This shell variable is specific to our module. This will actually give you all of the recent commands that you've run. But not only that, but also the latest service response. So what was the output of maybe your git EC2 instance call, for example? And if you run git or AWS history, this variable, you can tack on these properties like the .commands. And then there's all the commands that ran previously. Notice I've run git EC2 instance several times. Each of those invocations of that commandlet had responses. And those are also basically .NET objects that you can kind of drill into. So to give you an idea, in the .NET world, we use the dot notation to kind of drill into these items. So you could do commands dot last service response, for example, and then that gives you some more information there. So this is a little bit more for debugging and kind of diving deep into the output. But notice now that we've gotten all of these back, we're getting back objects that have a reservations collection, and that's what was returning the instances, a collection of instances based on that output. So if you tack on another property here and say reservations, and there you can see those are the list of instances that were basically coming back, or reservation objects more specifically. So just want to let you know about that AWS history shell variable so you can dig into the history there. So with all that, that's kind of the high-level setup and kind of getting started. Let's dive into creating EC2 instances. So to create a Windows EC2 instance, the first thing we need to do is figure out what AMI we want to use. So as you may know, the Amazon machine images for Windows are ones that we build in conjunction with Microsoft. We've got ones for Windows Server and things like that. So if you do a get EC2 image, that will give you every single AMI that's out there, whether it's a community AMI or it's one that we built. So an easier way to figure out what the AMI ID is going to be is run get EC2 image by name. And if you just run it without any parameters here, it'll give you some friendly names for, if you look at the first one, Windows _2012 R2 _base. That's the latest operating system, of course, with a bare OS. And we create AMIs monthly, usually 5 days after Patch Tuesday or within that time frame. So the AMI ID will change every month. Also, the AMI ID is going to be different in every region. So it's going to be important for you to utilize this commandlet to figure out what the appropriate ID should be. So to take this a step further, if you run that commandlet and provide that friendly name, so R2 _base, and let's just select the name here. Notice that this is, or remember that this is just running in Oregon, and I'm getting back two AMIs. So the first one on the list is the newest one that was created on September 10th, and then there's one other one out there from May. So obviously I want to use the first one in the list, and the friendly name here of the image is not what I want to use. I actually need the AMI ID or the image ID. So really what I'd want to do is select the image ID, and what you'll see is what you get back is basically an object with an image ID property. We just need the flat string, this first one in the list, that's the newest AMI ID. So that the select command that I'm using there is alias for select object. It has some useful parameters. So you could do something like, expand that property, so you don't have to have that header on there. And we can also say, give me the first one, which we know is the newest one, and then that'll just give you that AMI ID for the most current image in the region that you're in. So typically what I do is we'll store that in a variable. So variables are always prefixed with a $, and you use a variable name of something unique and something that's not in use by something else. So now that we have a reference to that AMI, now we can move on to creating an instance. So we can do a new EC2 instance. The image ID would be our variable, $win_AMI. And then we can do things like specify a minimum and a maximum. So something like this, where we could create in that reservation, because when you do a new EC2 instance, you're building a reservation, which is a collection of one or more virtual machines or EC2 instances. So I can do 10. I could do a number here. If I omit those parameters, it'll just do 1. So if I just want to do one instance, I can just continue on and tell it maybe the instance type, like an m3.large. I need to specify my key name. So if I want to be able to decrypt the Windows password after the instance comes online, I need to have a key created in the region that I'm in already. I've already created a key called Oregon for that US West 2 region. So there's a bunch of different parameters on there, but in this case, if I just hit enter, it'll go out there and it'll fire up that instance. And if we hop over to the EC2 console and do a refresh here, you can see that now I've got this initializing pending instance that's coming online. It has no name specified because that's a tag. We'll show how to tag this thing, so that'll show up there. And then notice that it also already got a public IP. And that's because I didn't specify which VPC I wanted it to go in, and it's going into the default VPC, which has a route to the internet, and by default it's just going to get a public IP assigned. So we'll show ways that you can control that and do things with VPCs, with your own VPC, and kind of customize things as we go forward. But that's kind of a high level. But if you run back over here into the ISE, you can see that now we don't really have a way to reference that instance, because if we get we run get EC2 instance, we're going to get back everything that's there, even the ones I've terminated. We'd have to do some filtering there to figure out which one is the one we just recently created. So a nice way to kind of get around that is, let me clear this, and I'm going to up arrow back to one of my previous commands. I'm going to save this in $I. So again, this is just a random variable I'm creating. This gives me the ability to store a reference to that virtual machine or that EC2 instance in the variable. So after it's created, then I can go on, I can tag it with other commands, I can add storage to it, because I'm going to need that instance ID in order to do anything else to it later on in my script. So that's why I'm saving it in this variable. One of the other things that you'll notice as well is that when you do this and you kind of echo back that variable, what you get back doesn't look like a machine, because it's essentially a reservation or a collection of EC2 instances. So instead of just storing the output in a variable, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll expand this instances property, because that's the property where all of the instances are actually assigned to or stored in as a collection. So to give you an idea of what that would look like, I usually do something like this. And then that way, when I create an instance and echo back $I, now I can see that all of the interesting properties about an EC2 instance, and I can see the subnet that it went into. I can see the private IP address it got in that default VPC, and now and of course the real thing that I need is the instance ID if I want to be able to easily manage it going forward. So that's kind of a nice way to do things. So from here, I could do $I.instance ID. And when I'm going to tag the instance, for example, I can just use that variable with that property to reference that virtual machine. So let's go ahead and talk about security groups real quick, because obviously since that went into the default VPC, it's also going to inherit the default security group that's out there. So if we run git ec2 security group, I've actually got the default one that's always out there by default, and I had one that I created for demo purposes as well. So let's focus on the default one real quick. Let me go ahead and store. So let me do a git security group. Let me select the first one, and let me store that in a variable. So I'm going to grab that default security group and store it in that variable. Now what I want to do is look at sg.ip permissions. Those are the actual ingress rules on the security group. So you can see here that I went in and I added an additional ingress rule that's not there by default to allow remote desktop, so TCP port 3389, from any IP address. So as I launch those instances, I can RDP into that environment. But what if you wanted to do that by PowerShell? You wanted to do that from scratch. So let me show you how to do that. Let's actually go to that security group real quick. Let's just go ahead and blow away that rule, and we'll recreate it through PowerShell just so you can see the syntax. So let's clear the screen here, and what I'm going to do is create an object. You'll actually see this in our documentation as well, and this is more of a developer-centric type of thing, but I'm going to say $IP equals new object, and the actual type name is amazon.ec2.model.ip permission. And what that's going to do is that's going to give you an object that's essentially a blank rule. Now you can go and populate the port information. You can say the 2 is going to be 3389 for RDP. The from is the same. So instead of doing a whole port range, we're just doing one. We're using the same number for both. The actual IP protocol will be TCP, and then we'll do the actual IP ranges, and this one's a little tricky. You got to use the add method on there, and of course, we always recommend that you use your actual public IP that you're coming from to do this. I'm only using, everything as a crutch, basically, as an easy way to do this. But you definitely want to specify your own IP address for these type of security groups where you're already pinging in over the internet. But anyway, there's that rule, right? We've populated it. We've got the port numbers. We've got the IP ranges and the everything else that we need. Now we can assign this rule to that security group. So let's clean up the screen a bit, and what we can do here is grant EC2 security group ingress or egress. So remember, security groups always have basically no egress restrictions or no outbound restrictions. On the ingress or inbound side, we do. So if we want to get into the EC2 instances, that's we use the ingress version of that commandlet, and then we'll just tell it the group ID, which was that sg dot group ID was the property name, and then the actual IP permissions are going to be that $IP object, which is my single ingress rule. And I could create multiple of those, and I could create a list here, so I could comma separate them. So if you wanted to do multiple ingress rules for different port numbers, you could do that. But I'm just going to do one here, and I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. Now if we swing back over to the console and do a refresh, you can see that the RDP rule reappears down at the bottom. And now I can RDP into that instance that I created earlier, and everything's good to go there. So that's how you do security group rules through the shell. You can also create new security groups. So if you did something like new SG2 or $SG2 equals new EC2 security group, you can do that, and then you'll get a reference. You got to specify a group name here. Test group, for example. Got to specify a description as well. Don't worry if you see red, that happens a lot. And you just need to read the error message, and it'll tell you usually exactly what you need to do. Right, so there we go. And now $SG2 gives you the security group ID. And if you want to build your rules, now you can go and grant ingress rules to this group ID. So you would basically put this variable, up here as the value for this group ID parameter. All right, so it's easy to create a new rule and add rules to it, or you can just add rules to existing groups, and we've seen that already. Okay, so let's clear up the screen here and move on to the next item. Now, one of the things we didn't do, if we look in the console under instances, is we have a bunch that I created that some of them I kept track of, the most recent one I did, but we haven't tagged anything, and that's very important. Tagging it with a name tag. If we look at SRV01 and look at tags, this has a special meaning. If you use the key name, it's always going to show up in this column right here. So we definitely want to do that. And of course, if you're doing multiple environments in the same account, if you're doing dev, test, production, and all of those environments have the same server name, it's also useful to tag it maybe with the environment. Maybe this is dev, maybe this is test, and so on. You can do other things like create tags for the time you created the instance, or the last time you did an EC2 or an EBS snapshot, the last time you backed up the instance. So tags are very useful, of course, and that's not necessarily a PowerShell thing, right? It's just an AWS thing, but you can manage them all from PowerShell. You can create them, you can query based on those values. So to give you an idea what that would look like, let's do a new EC2 tag. The resource itself is going to be that $i .instance ID, and that $i is that reference to that last EC2 instance that I created. And then now I want to specify a tag, or I could specify multiple tags, but let's start off with one. So the syntax here uses hash table syntax. You need to use the @ sign and the curly braces, and inside there you specify a key value pair. And essentially what you need to do is tell it that the key is going to be, or I'm sorry, the name is going to be, let's see, was it, I got to think about this for a second. Was it name or was it, oh, it's key. So this is the thing that you'll get used to after a while. You got to remember that it's actually key, and then you specify the key is name. So remember, we were looking in the console and looking at the actual keys. So here, this is one way easy to remember it. Key is name, and then value will be whatever you want it to be. So doing that, we specify the key, we do a semicolon, and then do the next one. So value would be, in this case, maybe SRV02. So a little bit of a tricky syntax, but again, you could actually do multiple tags here. So you could do a comma separated list and put multiple hash tables. And what that would look like is something like this. If you had, something like this with multiple tags, you just comma separate them and put one object, one key pair or one hash table at a time. I'm just going to do the name of the server here. And there we go. We've tagged that instance. We run back over, refresh. Now we can see that SRV02 is tagged. It's easy to find in the console, but it's also easy to find in PowerShell as well. So if you do a get EC2 instance, we have a filter parameter. And a lot of these get commandlets have filter parameters where you can pass in basically another hash table that says, what is the key value pair I'm looking for? Am I looking for tags? And if so, if I'm looking for a tag called name, what value should that be? So for example, if I was trying to find or grab a reference to that instance after the fact, maybe I'd come in and start up a new shell and I want to query that instance and figure out what its current status is. I would pass in a new hash table, and what we would do is specify a little bit different of a syntax here. And to be honest, I always have to think very hard about this, because you saw me earlier wonder, is this supposed to be key or is it supposed to be name? It's because the syntax is different when you're using a filter than when you're actually creating a tag. And that's just something that you have to get used to. You could, of course, write your own PowerShell functions to kind of wrap up some of this functionality if you're an advanced scripter, and kind of build your own script-based commandlets. But this is the basic syntax to get going. And if I run enter there, it does query based on that tag, and it retrieves that instance for me. Now I've got the ability to work with it. I could store it in a variable. I could do other things, add storage to it, that kind of thing. And this filter parameter is well documented. So you notice that I put tag : name, and essentially the filter parameter is looking for this special syntax. And there's a special syntax based on things you might be looking for. So beyond tags, there's all kinds of other things. And this is where the help system that we looked at earlier comes into play. So to give you an idea, if I run help on get EC2 instance on the parameter called filter, that'll actually tell me what is the right syntax to use. We saw what it is for searching by tags, but there's other things as well. There's the network interface address, private IP address. There's things for the virtualization type, the VPC ID. And you can just scroll through this list, and that kind of tells you what those IDs need to be. So you would just replace that previous syntax that I used. Instead of using a tag, you might use the availability zone, right? You want to figure out which AZ, you want to find EC2 instances in a specific AZ, for example. So run that filter, run help on that filter parameter on any Git commandlet that you're using and you're wanting to filter with. And generally, you'll get good output here, and to give you an idea of how it works. Okay. So let's clean up the screen. And we've looked at tagging and searching by tags. Let's go ahead and real quick, I want to hop over to an EC2 instance I created earlier in an RDP session. And just to let you know, we always install the AWS Tools for PowerShell on the Windows instances. So you can come in here and you have the commandlets installed already. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that notice that if I do a get AWS credentials and list stored credentials, that I don't have any on this machine, but if I do a get EC2 instance, specify the region, you can see that that actually works. And that's because I haven't stored the credentials on this instance, but I have provided credentials through an IAM role. So I created an IAM role in Identity and Access Management. The role is very specific, that only allows the machine assigned to that role to query or describe the EC2 instances. So it can't change anything. It can really only run get commands, essentially. But the nice thing is that I don't have to embed credentials anywhere in this machine, even though if they're encrypted or not. I didn't have to put them in my code if I'm running a script, if I'm using an EC2 instance to be kind of my my master server to execute all of my PowerShell scripts. It can just inherit that role, and you can kind of see the roles, and you can also see other metadata by querying that from PowerShell on an EC2 instance. So you can use PowerShell's invoke REST method. And you may have seen this this URL. If you hit 169.254.169.254/latest, this is basically like a loopback address on the EC2 instance. And if you query this, this will give you information about the instance. So just running there, you can see we've got metadata. Running it again, you can see that we've got the host name, we've got the AMI ID. To give you an idea, run it again with the AMI ID and kind of drill into these subfolders, so to speak. And then you can see that we're able to figure out what the AMI ID is by just querying the metadata URL. So that's kind of useful depending on what you're doing with your scripts. And I would encourage you to browse through all of these on your own with the invoke REST method and just see what kind of data in there, what might interest you, and how you could use that in your scripts. But one thing I wanted to point out real quick, and I ran this command much earlier. Let me run git history, and I believe it. History number 11 is where I was looking at the security credentials, where my IAM role was. So let me invoke item 11. That's in my PowerShell history. And basically what I'm doing is I'm hitting the metadata IAM security credentials, and then my actual IAM role is called EC2 test. And you can see that in here I've got my access key and my secret key that they're being generated. Those are temporary credentials provided by the IAM role. We rotate the credentials automatically for you several times a day, and that way, if they ever get compromised, it's just going to change anyway at a later time. And again, this is just a nice way for you to not have to worry about storing credentials somewhere on a machine. Okay, and then so let's move back over to the ISE here on my management workstation. One of the last things I just want to take you through real quick is creating an instance that has an additional EBS volume. So the ones that we created earlier are going to get a 30 gig root EBS volume, but no additional unless you're doing an instance type that has some instance storage, some ephemeral data. But maybe you want to have a secondary EBS volume, for example, as you launch the instance. So basically the idea would be you want to create a variable to store a new object. The object type is going to be Amazon EC2.model.EBS block device. And if you actually look at that thing, it's got all the properties that you would notice about a regular EBS volume. Really, the only ones that we need to populate are the volume size. Maybe we'll make that 100 gig, and then the volume type, which will be, in this case, we'll use the latest volume type, which is going to be general purpose, or GP2 is the short name for that. That's the new SSD type storage, where you get burstable IOPS up to 3,000 on those on those 30 minutes if it's a boot volume. And then of course you get 3 IOPS per gig for every gigabyte allocated, all the way up to 3,000. So that was easy to create the volume. Now we just have to create a mapping for that. And so you would create a new object. And again, I'm just using a variable called map. This is going to be an amazon.ec2.model.block device mapping. And now if you look at the map, essentially the key properties here are the device name and the actual EBS volume. So you specify the map.device name, and these will be those device names that you see, as you're kind of going through a wizard in the console, something like XVDF, and then you just tell it the volume, which would be $vol. And then if you go back and create a new EC2 instance, let's look at our Git history. We did a new EC2 instance on line 161. So if we get history on 161, there's that command, and now I can just easily copy it out of there. So I don't have to retype the whole thing. But what I do want to do is have a block device mapping, and I'll just say $map. And now when I create the instance, I'll get the regular root volume. I'll also get that additional 100 gig volume. And I'll go ahead and hit enter just to kick that off. I didn't tag it, but if I refresh in here, we'll see that the one that's pending and coming online is that one. And if we look at the storage, of course, block devices haven't initialized yet, but eventually you'll see both of them in here. Okay, so let's move on real quick. We've got about 5 minutes left. Let me go ahead and show you a couple scripts here. So I want to talk about bootstrapping an instance with user data. So user data is a script that you can run. By default, it runs the first time the instance comes online. And basically, there's an EC2 config service that runs on the instance. And essentially, it queries the metadata, and it'll see that you've got user data out there, and it'll build a PowerShell script out of it. And the way that you format the data for that is by creating a variable, like I am here, that's base64 encoded, and that is enclosed in these PowerShell tags. And essentially, if we build this and pass it into the user data field, the EC2 config service will create a PS1 script out of it. And what you'll end up with in that script is anything that's inside those tags. So in this case, I'm just creating a script to rename the computer. And notice that when I run new EC2 instance, I've got my winAMI variable. I'm telling it the key name, the instance type, all that good stuff. But I'm also using now this user data parameter and specifying that variable. So as the instance boots, the first time it'll run that script, it'll rename the computer and reboot. All right, so that's a very basic example. Let me now take you into kind of our more complex or complete server infrastructure. So what we're going to build here in this script, we have a script that'll build this complete environment out for you. Usually we do things in 2 availability zones for high availability, but this is essentially a reference to show you how to do it in 1 availability zone, and then of course you could replicate that and build all the infrastructure in a 2nd availability zone. But the idea is that we want to have, especially in a Windows world where we've got domain controllers and things like that, it's nice to put those application servers in a private subnet that's shielded from the internet and kind of sits behind a public subnet, which acts as a DMZ. So, we've got a remote desktop gateway in that DMZ. So if we want to do RDP and remote administration across the internet, we can do that without actually exposing the web server or the domain controller directly to the internet. And then there's a NAT instance in the public subnet as well that provides outbound internet access for the web and domain controllers in that private subnet. So if we want to go out and do Windows updates, we can, and things like that. So, notice we've got elastic IPs on the instances in the public subnets, and of course to settle this up properly, we have to build multiple subnets. We have to build this new VPC to use these new address spaces, so the 10 dot network. And then of course there's routes between subnets and things like that. So that all has to be done through code. And what I'm going to do here is just pull up a script that'll do all of this for you. It's called fullstack.ps1. This will be in the download that you can grab after this presentation. And this is probably more of a, more advanced type of script. We're providing parameters. So, when you call the script, we'll initialize like the VPC CIDR to this CIDR range. We'll specify the private and public subnets. You can override these as well by specifying the parameter values. You can specify the key name, the domain controller IP address. we've got an internal function here that will build a security group rule. So instead of typing it out over and over and over, we can kind of break off that piece and kind of add some abstraction, if you will. So you can just call a new security group rule like you would for a commandlet, populate those parameters, typing out this huge block of. And then the interesting stuff is where we get into the user data. So we're creating user data for the remote desktop gateway. We're actually doing some stuff in here to like reset the password. We're doing things like installing Windows features. If you look at the user data for the web server, we're doing that as well. We're also doing some things like setting the primary DNS server address to the domain controller so we can join the domain. We're adding the computer to the domain, and that, of course, assumes that the domain controller has been created. Let me show you the user data for the domain controller real quick, because this is the interesting part, and then we'll kind of wrap up this presentation because we are getting short on time at this point. So real quick, the user data script for the domain controller. Now, I told you earlier that the user data script will only run one time, but that's customizable. There's a config.xml file that the EC2 config service uses to control that. So what you could do is you could write an advanced type of script that re-enables that feature, and every time the script runs, it has logic built in to figure out what phase of the deployment are we in. And kind of the idea is what I came up with on this one, and this is a similar pattern that other folks sometimes use, is we'll store basically in the registry kind of this run count of the success or failure, and what run count we're actually on in terms of where we're at. So initially the script will go in and create a registry key for that, and it'll call a key called run count and set it to 0. And then we'll query that run count and see where we're currently at. Because remember, the script is going to run every time the system boots. So if we run it and it's 0, it means it's the first time we've run it. Then this is a PowerShell construct called a switch, and we're basically just checking the run count. In here, the switch, we're switching on that variable. If it's 0, then we're going to run basically this block of code, everything that's in these curly braces. So we're going to reset the local administrator password. We're going to run a little script that's going to set the IP statically. We're going to install the components for AD domain services. We go ahead and set that run count value in the registry to 1, because the next time it reboots, we want the next block of code to run. So we set that. We enable the user data to run every time, basically, or to run again when we reboot. You can see that we open the XML file and change that EC2 handle user data to enabled. And then we save it, and then we rename the computer and reboot. So when it reboots, we query that registry key again. This time it'll be 1. That's our next block of code. So the switch will match here and only run this code. We won't run any code that we ran in here on 0, because that doesn't match. So after we got all the prereq type of stuff configured in that first block, after the reboot, we come up, we create a secure password object, and then we go ahead and promote this guy to a domain controller. And if you actually look through the script, we sequence everything in order. So the domain controller will go first, we'll sleep a while, and then the web server will come online. He'll bootstrap himself, he'll join the domain. And what you end up at the end is an architecture just like we saw in the Visio diagram. But if you step through this code, we're using comments here. So notice this, we use the hash, and that's basically a reference to a comment. So we're really well commenting through this code and telling you what we're doing. So of course, the first step is to create a VPC. We're sleeping here for a little bit. We're going through creating all of the subnets and all of that kind of thing. And then to run that, essentially, that's out on my desktop, I believe. You would run, full stack. You could specify the parameters if you want, but most of them are going to initialize those default values. So in my environment, I don't even need to change anything, but you probably would want to change the key name to your own key name. If you want to change the address spaces, you could do that by changing the VPC CIDR, the private and public subnets, that kind of thing. I'll just run it without anything, and it'll just go through and create that. Now this is also an advanced function, so if you do tack on the -verbose parameter, it'll give you more details as to what it's doing, because we have write verbose statements throughout every phase of this script. So you can see right here, you'll get status on creating subnets and things like that. So with that, that's kind of the whirlwind tour across kind of creating instances and bootstrapping them. I hope you found this presentation useful.